Welcome back to another episode of Archie Sonic Character Files as we explore the histories of the inhabitants on planet Mobius. In this episode, we take a look at the history of Robotnik's scheming nephew, known as Snively Robotnik. Well, here we are with another long episode. Last time I focused on some good guys, so I figured it was finally time to focus on a major villain. And hey, Snively is an entertaining character, so this will be a fun episode in covering his lore for both timelines and everything else. But first, we're going to take a slight detour in talking about his rather odd early appearances. Much like Bunny Rabbit, Snively wasn't featured with the cast when the Archie Sonic comics started, so you might be wondering who was Robotnik's original assistant, or if he had one at the beginning. Well, in the very early days of Archie Sonic, Robotnik had a crabmeat badnik to be his personal assistant to boss around. Yeah, it's kind of odd, but I guess the team just found him more interesting compared to all the other badniks from Green Hill Zone. And you might be wondering, well, why not Cluck? Why not use him since they're using Robotnik's Sad AM look? Well, outside of a handful of cameos, Cluck wasn't really part of the main established cast. When they did decide to feature Snively in the comics, his first appearance was in issue 6 in their Christmas Carol spoof playing the role of Jacob Marley. In this case, Jacob Snarly, haha. But the whole story was just a dream, so it doesn't really count in terms of canon. His first canonical appearance would be 2 issues later. As the series continued, they would go back and forth about Robotnik having either Snively or Crabmeat being his faithful lackey. There were a few times they both got to be on screen together, but there wasn't any banter between them over who was the best in serving Robotnik. Eventually, Crabmeat would be phased out, and Snively would become a more established character to the lore of Archie Sonic. Funny enough, his new canon counterpart also had a very odd introduction, where his first appearance was actually in Sonic Universe issue 62. Well, specifically the one that had the variant cover. The standard cover had a different ending. Yeah, this was back in the day when they did that whole after the credits gimmick for Sonic and Mega Man comics. And with that out of the way, let's begin Snively's history. At birth, he was originally known as Colin Kintobor Jr., and life wasn't so simple for this guy. His mother died shortly after giving birth to him, and he was left in the hands of his father, Colin Kintobor Sr., who lacked any parenting skills. As the years passed, young Colin Jr. developed an interest for controlling electronics, and when it comes to making friends, he prefers to use them for his own personal gain. Because of his antics, this earned him the nickname Snively by his father. Later on, Colin Sr. was fed up with his son's antics and kicked him out. On his own, Snively decided to visit Mobotropolis and turned to the one person he thought that would appreciate him, which was his uncle, Julian Kintobor. Together, they would serve King Max during the Great War, while secretly scheming behind his back to take over the kingdom by building robot armies, and later obtaining the roboticizer that was originally created by Sir Charles Hedgehog. Once the plans were in place, Robotnik gave Snively the command to start the coup d'etat, and they succeeded in turning Mobotropolis into Robotropolis. Now Robotnik reigned supreme, while Snively would remain being his assistant, and this guy would have his hands full with Sonic the Hedgehog and his gang of freedom fighters that were trying to reclaim their kingdom. Throughout their war of nature versus technology, Snively would assist Dr. Robotnik in many ways, like creating a shrinking device, assist Robotnik in finding Mobians at the Mobian Mountains, chasing after the freedom fighters to the planet Muckery, help Robotnik find his long-lost creation King Gong, and many other missions. Other times, he would get his jollies from witnessing Sally Acorn getting roboticized for the first time, as well as beginning plans to take over. After Robotnik gets trapped in the void from a failed experiment, Snively decided that this would be the perfect opportunity to get out of Robotnik's shadow and start running things on his own, even dressing up as Robotnik, even if red really isn't his color. While he was successful in trapping Sonic in the void and planned to do the same for the rest of the freedom fighters, he wasn't so successful at stopping Sonic's Uncle Chuck, who was able to free Sonic and Robotnik. Thus, he was back to being the assistant again. As the days passed with many victories from the freedom fighters and more abuse from Robotnik's wrath, Snively became more and more resentful against his uncle. He still acted loyal to Robotnik during Operation Endgame, where Robotnik plans to use the Ultimate Annihilator to be rid of the freedom fighters and Knothole once and for all. But the little schemer had other plans in mind. When Dr. Quack was captured and forced to help Robotnik's big scheme, Snively secretly began to reprogram the Doomsday weapon so that the only thing that it would actually destroy was his own uncle. And so the final battle between Sonic and Robotnik began. The Ultimate Annihilator was fired, and by the end of it all, his plan was a success. This was the end for the original Dr. Robotnik, But this was only the beginning for Snively. With Robotnik out of the picture, it didn't take long for Sonic and the gang to head over to Robotropolis to start making it like their old home again. But Snively wouldn't go down without a fight and sent out a dynamic 3000 robot to stop the Freedom Fighters. When they discovered where he was hiding, Snively tried to make a run for it, only to be captured by Jeffrey St. John, and was later sent to Devil's Goulash, a prison island far away from both Knothole and Robotropolis. But even a prison cell wouldn't stop Snively from causing trouble. When he overhears that Exus Nagus has returned, he secretly activates the last batch of egg robos to find and maintain the wizard's magical powers. But his plans ended up going nowhere once they were destroyed by Sonic, Sally, Antoine, and the former prisoner, Monkey Khan. While Snively boasts about what he'll do to Sonic once he escapes, a sudden jailbreak happens without explanation. After the guards are taken care of, the inmates decided to make Snively their leader, believing that he was the one that caused the jailbreak. Snively reluctantly agrees to this, and they steal a hovercraft to return to Robotropolis to cause trouble for Sonic and the Freedom Fighters. During the attack, they capture the scientist Nate Morgan, and Snively tries to convince him to join his team. Nate refuses, and before Kodos could kill him, they were stopped by Sonic and the Secret Service. After the battle, it was believed that Snively had died from an explosion, but it turns out the sniveling shrimp found himself teleported onto a space station with the looming presence of his deceased uncle, Robotnik. Except this wasn't the Robotnik from his dimension, but rather a Robotnik from an alternate universe known as Robo-Robotnik Mark II. And he had big plans to take over the main Mobius, including roboticizing Snively for killing the original Robotnik. Once the Freedom Fighters got involved, Snively released them from being trapped in a force field to stop Robo-Robotnik Mark II, claiming that this wasn't the uncle that he knew and hated. Even after the defeat, Robo-Robotnik Mark II would upload his data into a new robot body and retook Robotropolis for himself. As for the Freedom Fighters, they weren't finished with Snively just yet. With things looking ugly at Robotropolis, Snively is forced to team up with the Freedom Fighters to sneak into the city before the new Robotnik has a chance to access the Knothole files. After dealing with some shadow bots, they were successful in corrupting the file with a virus before leaving. And with another mission accomplished, Snively has had enough adventuring for one day, and leaves the group to be on his own again. Was he moving on with his life, or did the Freedom Fighters regret having to turn their backs on Snively? Sometime later, a group of Overlanders return to Mobius after spending years in their spaceship in outer space. The second Robotnik offers to keep them safe in Robotropolis, away from the Mobians, knowing their long history and prejudice against them. One day, Snively was caught breaking curfew in Robotropolis and was sent to prison. The second Robotnik visits his cell to offer Snively the position of being his personal assistant, and with the promises of getting revenge on his father, Snively eagerly agrees to this. After doing some catching up with Colin Kintobor Sr., Snively continues to help Robotnik's latest plan of having the Overlanders infected with toxic waste poisoning, so that they were willing to be roboticized by Robotnik's new power by simply touching them. Those who resisted would become nothing more than metallic statues. He had the pleasure to watch his father turn to metal, but Snively finds out that he too has been infected. But Robotnik reassures him that he'll be saved with a simple handshake, and with that, Snively has been roboticized, just like his own uncle. This wouldn't last long once Station Square launched a nuclear attack at Robotropolis. Fortunately, Robotnik was quick enough to transfer his and Snively's data into cyberspace. After running around in said cyberspace, Snively got himself a new robot body, something more tall and thin and more handsome. Which was also short-lived thanks to Robotnik blowing it up, and once again Snively was stuck with the short stature. Even so, he would find himself teleported by the BEM in their experiment on organic material versus metallic material by having Sonic and Tails become robots, while making himself and Robotnik human again. In the end, Robotnik and Snively were teleported back to their home, now forever stuck as humans after losing to Mecha Sonic and Mecha Tails. After this story, Snively was MIA for a while. We then jump ahead 1 year later, where the Freedom Fighters spot Snively snooping around Megaopolis. They believe that he's responsible for capturing Bunny Rabot, but he assures them that he has nothing to do with this. He offers to help the group, and considers it as a revenge for Robotnik replacing him with his new son, Adam. Once the Terror was defeated and Bunny rescued, Snively moved to Knothole to start the Brain Trust, a small group of some of the smartest civilians in Knothole to study and experiment this new nanite technology. It looks like Snively was beginning to turn over a new leaf with his new life. But alas, with all the battles with the Freedom Fighters over the years, he just couldn't shake off the idea that he belonged with the Freedom Fighters. As the days passed, he pondered over his existential crisis until the second Robotnik showed up to offer him one more chance of being his assistant. Rather than join him right away, he quickly rushes over to his half-sister, Hope Kintobor. Knowing that she would be in danger, he suggests that Hope should move to the United Federation, someplace where she could be with her own kind and continue her skills of being a mechanic, in which Hope agrees to this. And with that out of the way, Snively was once again reunited with Robotnik. He started wearing some new duds, while gazing upon Robotnik's new egg fleet that were ready for action. As they say, old habits die hard. Back at the Eggman Empire, it was business as usual for Snively, although he did lose his hair in the process when Shadow came by demanding the location of Gerald Robotnik's diary. This event really set him off, as he later piloted an egg lobster in his pursuit to find Shadow and get his hairs back, which he eventually does, but not before Shadow destroys the egg lobster and reminding him of his real purpose in life. Other times, he was still keeping up with the backstabbing schemes, like when he tried to take full control of Metal Sonic, only for Robotnik to remind him that he's one step ahead of him. He later played a role in the destruction of Knothole by breaking into Freedom HQ and teleporting most of the Freedom Fighters and Chaotix members to the Egg Grapes. Later on, he had to deal with Hope Kintobor attacking the Egg Fleet and furious at Snively and going back to Robotnik to once again hurt her friends from Knothole. As she flies away, saying that she'll become a great engineer to help kick his butt and Robotnik's, a heartbroken Snively couldn't bear to authorize the command to fire at her, and instead took his side of the Egg Fleet and retreated. He would later help Robotnik in an attempt to capture the resurrected Interjack in the new and improved Egg Grapes, but even that wasn't enough to hold down a god of destruction. Over time, Snively's life became very lonely and miserable in his time in the Egg Dome. Robotnik had become more sloppy and desperate with his recent work, and the newly acquired Dark Egg Legion showed him no respect. While doing his routine checkups on the Egg Network, he came into contact with the Iron Queen from the Dragon Kingdom. The two of them would chat and bond, and later deciding on meeting up physically for the first time. As the days passed, he came to the conclusion that Robotnik's sanity really was becoming fragile, especially in one instance when he called him by his original birth name. And sure enough, after a big battle between Sonic and Robotnik inside the Egg Dome, the Eggman finally cracked. Snively reveals to both Sonic and Sally that Robotnik had been slipping after his recent defeat at New Mobotropolis, and this battle had finally broken him after recent failures. He insists that the Freedom Fighters go home and celebrate their victory, while he tends to his poor uncle, and that's exactly what they do. Well, for Sonic and Sally anyway. Snively, on the other hand, put his uncle in a straitjacket and tossed him into a padded cell. Now that old Eggbelly was out of commission, it was finally time for Snively to take full control of the Eggman Empire. And this time, he's not alone. Snively felt like he was on top of the world now that the Iron Domain had arrived. With the combined forces of the Dark Egg Legion and the Yagu clan, they didn't waste any time in causing trouble for Sonic and the people of New Mobotropolis, while spending his downtime with his new love, the Iron Queen, as they hatch devious plots together and talk about their personal lives. Other times were rough, like when the mentally insane Robotnik broke out of his cell and tried to find Knothole, only to end with Sonic and the gang taking the Mad Doctor to their prison while they were unable to enter New Mobotropolis thanks to Nicole's nanite abilities. But knowing Snively, it didn't take him long to come up with a new plan. He tells the Iron Queen about the nanites that created New Mobotropolis, and that the best way to capture the city is by striking at the controller, Nicole. While the Iron Queen takes full control of Nicole, Snively visits his uncle at the jail cell, gloating about all the things he has accomplished and will soon rule over Mobius, even if Robotnik still isn't quite himself. With all the citizens rounded up and getting ready to be legionized, Snively pays Robotnik another visit, but this time the Mad Doctor isn't quite mad anymore. He orders Snively to release him so that he can begin his new evil schemes, only for Snively to mock and gloat about what he has accomplished once again. But when he mentions the Iron Queen, Robotnik laughs it off, saying that she never loved him, and that he could never love anyone else. While denying the claims, Snively leaves the cell and heads over to Mobotropolis' Coliseum to begin legionizing its citizens, starting off with his old Brain Trust colleague, Rotor Walrus. But in comes Sonic and his team to stop all the madness. With the Yagu clan disbanded, the Dark Egg Legion tending to their fallen Grandmaster, and the Iron King and Queen getting defeated, Snively made a mad dash back to the cell to release Robotnik, hoping that he'll know what to do. As they sneak out of the city, Snively asks Robotnik if they could go back and rescue the Iron Queen, to which Robotnik denies his request. Now they're back at the Egg Dome in a secret area, so that way Sonic and the others couldn't bother them. While this was the beginning for Robotnik, it was the end for Snively's reign of terror. Desperate for the love of his life to return, Snively made many attempts to contact Conquering Storm about sending supplies over and to free her from her prison. Robotnik soon caught on to his little scheme and forced him to drop the whole romance. And after struggling to answer, he finally admitted that his love for the Iron Queen was no more. He may have said what Robotnik wanted to hear, but he really didn't mean it. Later, he and Robotnik entered the Special Zone to obtain a Chaos Emerald. Feast, the ruler of the Special Zone, pitted the two no-goodniks in a race for his amusement. Snively tried to win so that he could have the Emerald and take control of the Eggman Empire once again and free the Iron Queen, but alas, nothing can ever outrun Robotnik. And now that the Death Egg Mark II is powered up and the Genesis Wave launched, nothing really changed for Snively. In this altered reality, Snively was a loyal assistant to Robotnik who had no beef against him. He first encountered Sonic in Green Hill Zone and tried to stop him with a wrecking ball, but he failed and retreated back to the Death Egg to continue operations. But all of that would soon be phased out thanks to Chaos Control reverting Mobius back to what it was. Back in the main reality, the Death Egg Mark II was severely damaged, Sally had been roboticized once again, and the Chaos Emerald had disappeared. He grows frustrated at Robotnik for being too occupied in upgrading the new Mecha Sally, rather than taking the critical situation in the Death Egg seriously. Tensions only rise even more when Robotnik sent out Metal Sonic to self-destruct and harm Antoine, and then calling it a day. This was the final straw for Snively, and he began to set his plans into motion to finally take down Robotnik once and for all. First, he creates a message to the Dark Egg Legion saying that he's disbanding their group while claiming that Sonic had finally defeated Robotnik. Next, he leaves behind a bunch of Snively infiltrators to keep Robotnik busy. Then, he pays a visit to Hope Kintobor in Central City, in the hopes that she'll help him in his plans. At first, Hope tries to alert Gun, but Snively begs to hear him out. He claims that he's moved on from Robotnik and wants to start a new family in the Dragon Kingdom. But it didn't take long for his true colors to show, as he wanted Hope to be more of a pawn in his plan. And with a slap to the face, Snively left an emotionally damaged Hope behind and headed straight for the Dragon Kingdom. Inside the Iron Queen's cell, the Mistress was furious at Snively for leaving her behind and yelled at him to get out. But Snively was determined to show that he did all of this for her. And after finding some old tech in her kingdom, he broke her out of the cell and the two made up. Now that Robotnik has arrived, it all boiled down to a one-on-one fight. The Assistant versus the Master. The Iron Oni versus the Egg Beater 2. With the fate of the Eggman Empire hanging in the balance. In the end, Robotnik would come out on top and destroyed the Iron Oni. After the battle, it looked as though Robotnik decided to show mercy for his nephew by having him and the Iron Queen control the Legionized section of the United Federation. But unbeknownst to the Queen, this was in fact another one of Snively's decoys, now reprogrammed to serve her. As for the real Snively, he was sealed away in an egg capsule and was left in a section of the Death Egg Mark II, a section that only Robotnik knows about. And that was it. Outside of a very brief cameo in the Worlds Collide crossover, this was the end for Snively. He had lost everything to his uncle once again, and now he's trapped deep within the Death Egg, alone and abandoned. Once the Super Genesis Wave was activated, along with a botched attempt at Chaos Control, Fate had other plans in mind for the scheming schemer. Life started off pretty simple for Dr. Julian Snively, working at Guardians Units of Nations, or GUN for short, and advancing the development of their technology. One day, he quote-unquote stumbled upon data files for world domination being planned out by one of his co-workers, Dr. Robotnik. He offered him the position of Chief Engineer, in which he happily agreed to, and after getting some help from the wizard Nagas, they would soon find themselves in Mobotropolis. Once inside, they alerted King Nigel Acorn that the United Federation was planning to invade the kingdom in secret. After discussing the situation for a while, the king allowed both Robotnik and Snively full access to his lands and resources. They spent many days and nights constructing and setting their plans in motion. Some of Snively's noticeable contributions was the creation of the Chemical Plant Zone and the construction on the Death Egg. Once both King Acorn and Nagas were banished to the Special Zone, Robotnik took over Mobotropolis and its islands, with Snively being his assistant, still loyal as ever. Their next step for world domination was traveling to South Island to try and find the Chaos Emeralds. but their plans would soon be thwarted by a young Sonic the Hedgehog. They later tried West Side Island, but once again Sonic was there to stop him, along with the help of his buddy Tails. Sometime later, after the discovery of Angel Island, Snively would once again help Robotnik, this time piloting an egg robo and looking for the Master Emerald, while Robotnik was busy somewhere else on the island. It seems like this was finally time for Snively to step up to take over on the world domination plans, but he had his hands full dealing with the island's guardian, Knuckles the Echidna. When things looked bleak, Snively made a hasty retreat back to Gun headquarters. He was soon taken in for questioning for his disappearance at assisting Dr. Robotnik, in which Snively claimed that he was captured and forced to carry out Robotnik's dirty work, while secretly being a double agent. Years later, he would accompany Team Dark to Angel Island on their mission to find Eclipse the Darkling. He, Shadow, Relic, and Fix-It are left behind to look after the Emerald, while Knuckles, Rouge, and Omega search the island to find the alien. After witnessing Shadow and Eclipse fight it out, he insists that the Master Emerald should be secured by Gun. Relic questions his motives, but he reassures her that it's all good intentions to help protect the world, even though secretly he has other plans in mind for the Emerald. But alas, his plans would be put on hold once Knuckles shattered the Master Emerald to prevent Eclipse from getting his greedy little claws on it. After the battle, Dr. Snively arrived in a Gun aircraft to make sure that Eclipse's spaceship is handled with care so that he can study its technology, before getting yelled at by Knuckles to get off his island, knowing their troubled history in the past. Back at Gun, Snively was once again taken in for questioning due to his recent behavior, constantly insisting to move the Master Emerald somewhere else. And once again, he was sticking to his story. He was forced to carry out Robotnik's plans, he was actually a secret agent, and claims that he is now and forever loyal to the Guardian's units of nations. Even so, Gun Commander Abraham Tower still plans to keep a close eye on the little scientist. As they say, keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. And that concludes the history of Snively, the treacherous nephew in the Robotnik family. And boy, what a character. Always scheming, backstabbing, you never know what the little guy's gonna do next. And I just can't get enough of him. I kinda forgot that in a good chunk of his early appearances, he usually wore a blue shirt and brown pants. Yeah, very different from his usual green attire. Later on the colors would be changed to reflect his SatAM counterpart, and finally he'd start wearing a green variant of Eggman's outfit. Even if there was one instance when they accidentally colored it red. For the most part, it's a faithful version of his Sonic SatAM counterpart, starting off as the humble assistant to Robotnik, and then wanting to be in charge, believing that he can do a better job. Especially when he almost succeeds in the episode No Brainer, which is one of my personal favorites. Of course, there are some noticeable differences, like how he lost his hair. In Sonic SatAM, it was due to some time travel shenanigans by Sonic and Sally when they tried to travel back to the past to stop Robotnik's coup. But in the Archie Sonic universe, he simply states that he lost his hair due to male pattern baldness. The series ended on teasing that Snively would rise to power, but sadly the series was cancelled after that. But he would get to have his spotlight during the Ion Domain saga. And of course the death of the original Robotnik, where unlike his SatAM counterpart, he deliberately murdered his own uncle by reprogramming his latest weapon, really shows how far Snively would go for that taste of ultimate power. His interactions with the original Robotnik are what you'd expect from SatAM, and the same applies for the second Robotnik, for the most part. Once Ian Flynn started writing their interactions, then things became more interesting, Robotnik's ego and pettiness clashing with the strategic Snively. Sometimes Robotnik would get to have the final say, while other times they would just be at each other's throats. And then there's his relationship with the Iron Queen, being with someone that he can relate to. Definitely another highlight from the Iron Domain saga, seeing these two interacting and Snively doing whatever he can to please her, despite Robotnik's constant statements that she's just using him. And I think Robotnik's just saying that because he's jealous. And in his final appearance, it really shows how genuine his love is for the Iron Queen. And yet, the same can't be said about his half-sister, Hope. But at the same time, it does give Snively a lot more depth. At first, they really didn't get to have much screen time together during the whole deal of the Overlanders living in Robotropolis for a while, but we got to see a bit of that later on during Snively's short-lived time living in Knothole. He does care for his half-sister, and it's one of those rare moments where we get to see a more human side to Snively. But in every scene they have together, it's clear that evil schemes always come first over family. Not only does he end up hurting her emotionally, but he's also hurting himself in the process. The only other time we got to see a more human Snively was in issue 33 in the story Sonic Shot. Here, he brings a bunch of SWAT boss to play a game of hockey with Sonic and the others. and he's quite genuine about the whole thing. No schemes, no backstabbing, he just misses the thrill of the game after spending so much time on world domination, and all he wants is just a simple fair game of hockey. Sure, it might sound weird considering that this is also the same issue that gave us Parasite, but I still think it's a neat standalone story. Of course, there are some rough spots with this character, like, for a while he was very on and off on appearances. It is strange that he was completely absent during the Zorda War, considering how almost every hero and villain showed up to stop a greater threat. Apparently, writer Carl Boilers had plans in bringing back Snively as more of an anti-hero, teaming up with Shadow to fight Robotnik, controlling a robot body and calling himself Skarkus. But that whole idea ended up getting scrapped. Speaking of which, another scrapped idea came from Ken Penders, who planned on killing off the character at some point, where he sacrifices himself to shut down an unstable power plant, with his death leaving Sonic in grief. Might have been interesting, but I'm glad this idea got scrapped. Another thing I didn't like was the whole deal of Snively helping the freedom fighters at Brain Trust. It's mostly because, outside of his interactions with Hope, we barely see how he lives his temporarily reformed life in Knothole. Feels kind of pointless in a way. And how did Snively get his hair back on his head after the whole deal in issue 171 with Shadow? Did he just glue it back on his head, or did they just grow back? And then of course there's the whole deal of Snively being roboticized. Might have been interesting, but it just comes off as being more cosmetic. Speaking of which, this might be a good time to talk about Project Metal Snively. So, in issue 140, we get a small tease of a robot version of Snively, but it never goes anywhere, and in issue 163, he decides to shut it down, with Robotnik saying that he doesn't want any more of this henchman nonsense. Which is really weird, because in the previous issue he was all like, "Hey Snively, wanna be my lackey again?" I guess this particular story happens after the Darkest Storm story arc. The fate of Snively after the scrambled story is rather interesting. Was he just knocked out for a while before getting revenge? Or was this the definitive ending for the character? I like to believe it's the latter. No matter how many times Snively backstabs his uncle, no matter how many times he tries to reign supreme, he'll always be trapped in Robotnik's shadow. As for the new timeline, there's not much to say about him. It was kind of nice to see Snively again, now trading his strands of hair for a beard. I guess in this new timeline he's not a fan of hockey, but a big fan of Breaking Bad. Sure, he's no longer related to Robotnik in this new timeline, but he still helped him in the past when they adapted the classic Genesis games. You know that random egg robo that was pestering Knuckles during the events of Sonic and Knuckles? Well, it turns out that was Snively the whole time. Having him be a member of Gun was an interesting idea, especially when he claims that he's a good guy and loyal to the organization, even though the images in his origins tell a very different story. A real shame that we never get to see his big master plan realized. It looked like it would have involved the Master Emerald, a bunch of satellites, and the space colony Ark. Was he secretly still assisting Robotnik with this plan? Did he decide to take matters into his own hands for world domination? Or was he planning on creating the greatest laser light show? The world may never know. Well, that wraps up this episode. I'm definitely going to be taking a break from this series for a while, with how long this episode was. So until then, I got a juice!
I am the one who knocks.